Players Podcast. I'm Rusal. Thank you so much for joining me. If this is your first time joining me, the philosophy of this podcast is to speak to the players who are shaping the metagame so that their voices can be heard. This week's voice, Birbman, also known on MTGO as Entropy263. He's been on the podcast before because Birbman makes his own decks and he plays them to great success. He is definitely someone shaping the metagame, and at this time, he's having an absolute blast playing Bant. Welcome back to the podcast. It's been a while since we've spoken, and rather than have you run through the standard questions that I usually start the podcast with, since you've answered them before, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what you've been doing since we last spoke.
Yeah, sure. So I've been playing Pauper still. I've kind of dropped Tron more or less, mostly because I don't enjoy playing it that much, honestly, despite it being good. But I haven't stopped playing Pauper. Outside of that, I got super into D&D since the coronavirus decided to put us all on lockdown. And beyond that, I'm still a university student. I'm nearing the end of my degree now, but still same old there. Nothing much else has changed. It's kind of hard to when you can't leave the house.
So it also looks to me that you've been streaming an awful lot since the start of quarantine. And while I do intend to ask you advice for anyone looking to pick up your deck, what advice may you have for anyone who's considering starting to stream?
Oh yeah, so I don't think I'm your stereotypical streamer, so this one's pretty stereotypical. I stream because I enjoy it. Don't stream because you expect to get big or anything. That's definitely not the way to go. But a big reason why I stayed streaming is because I believe it makes me a better player. Not because I have viewers, even though it helps, but the main reason I still stream is because I'm forced to explain my plays. I talk about them out loud. And when I make bad plays, it's painfully obvious because I just said it out loud. And I have to come up with a reason as to why I make every play. So I've found a huge improvement in my skill level as I stream. And I've just it's hard to go back, I guess, to not explaining every play out loud.
What's funny is I actually just do that naturally without an audience. That's just me. That's how I've always played.
Yeah. It's a little easy to lie to yourself, though. Like, it's a lot easier to lie to yourself when you don't have people watching you and, I guess, keeping you honest. I don't know how to put it.
The accountability factor.
Yeah. I find myself lying to myself even though I'm not aware of it. Like, I'll look back further, a week or two ahead of time. Be like, man, what was I thinking? It sounded so nice when I was in the moment, but what was I thinking,
To an extent, I know what you're talking about. I do feel like I am guilty of that to an extent when I play poker, and I'm still doing the same thing. My thought process continually, just verbal stream of thoughts coming out. I do feel like I see things that aren't there sometimes in that game. But I do feel like with Pauper, I'm pretty quick to judge my own actions, pretty quick to realize that I made a mistake and, being a bit of a perfectionist, beat myself up for it. But this isn't really necessarily about me. Obviously, I was more curious if you just had any good, broad, general advice for anyone who may also want to start streaming, either just in general or maybe just a bit more now that we're sort of living in the quarantine zone. And I think that your thought of do it for yourself, do it because you enjoy doing it, is pretty solid advice, honestly.
Yeah, it's a little old. Everyone says it these days, but it really is true. If you're streaming because you want to treat it as a job or because you want to get popular, it's going to feel like a job. And then you're just not going to sound genuine in the way you stream. People can tell. And nobody wants to watch someone who feels disingenuous.
Yeah, definitely interesting. You think you started streaming a little bit more after the recent bans?
Definitely have. Bans are probably my favorite time of Pauper because I'm a known brewer and I love brewing. So anytime there's a ban, that's like my hunting grounds. I don't know a better way to put it. I just love brewing new decks, and what's a better time when everything is new, right?
Yeah, I think it's a very good opportunity when the format changes for a chef in the kitchen to add some more spice. And you're definitely one of those chefs. Now, before we get into the Bant's Flicker deck, or Bant Ephemerate, Perhaps I should be asking you what this deck is called, but before we discuss that, what are your thoughts on the bans themselves?
My thoughts on the bans themselves, I actually really like the Mystic Sanctuary ban, despite being someone who played that card in every deck since it was printed, basically. It was not healthy for Pauper, and the same reason I don't think Tron lands are healthy for Pauper. Uninteractable virtual card advantage, like not real advantage, but virtual advantage through lands that can't be interacted with is not healthy for a format that is chock full of interaction. So when I'm playing Sanctuary and generating value that my opponent can't stop, it allows you to convert tempo into actual card advantage rather than tempo into pressure or tempo into a one game. You can just play out your cards as aggressively as possible with the idea of gaining tempo, and Sanctuary can get all of that back off of one card because you have your opponent on the back pedal, so they're trying to answer what you've just slammed on the board rather than strategically playing up to the board, if that makes sense. And the map ban, I can't say I really agree with it because I don't think it did enough. Same reason for Tron. It sacrifices tempo for overwhelming value that can't be interacted with, and I would prefer to be able to interact with my opponents. Nothing makes me happier than a nice interactive game in Pauper. That's why I play Pauper.
I do think that interaction is a very good draw to the format. And certainly one of the things that I enjoy the most about Pauper is these massive stack battles, which can ensue when all the interaction costs 1 or 2 mana, and it's turn 8 or 9, and both players have been developing their game states, and then all of a sudden, madness happens. I thoroughly enjoy that, so... Definitely with you there. Also with you on being happy that Sanctuary is gone. It may sound strange, but I really didn't like playing with Sanctuary. And I like islands. But when they gave me the best island of all time, it was a bit much. All the games became repetitive and boring and redundant in...
I agree. A big part of that. So I don't know how versed you are in long matchups, as I like to play decks that have inevitability. I'm pretty used to them. So whenever you play against a deck that runs Counterspell and Scred, let's just use Blue-Red Fairies as an example. You know exactly how many answers they run in their deck, and you play to those answers. Like, you think, okay, they've used up 2 counterspells. I'm going to pressure their counter magic and run them out of it, and then I'm going to resolve my threat that's going to win me the game and turn the corner. Now, when Sanctuary exists, you don't know how many threats they have left. They have an undetermined infinite amount of threats that they can still have access to. So it just shuts down an entire avenue of playing that matchup out the second you sit down across from it. And that took away a lot from me. It took me a while to realize it because it's such a subtle thing, but that's a big part of playing a game against decks like that, I think.
With regard to the map ban, I think the intent was pure, but the execution was off. And it is worth noting that you can no longer sacrifice a map to go find a Mystic Sanctuary, but I don't think anyone was doing that.
No, nobody was. I agree the intent was there. I also think the execution was misguided. They wanted to hurt the consistency of Tron while still keeping Tron alive because they believe Tron is a draw to the format for players from like Modern and stuff. While they're not entirely wrong, I don't think that should be where they should be keeping their eyes. I think they should just ban the source of the problem rather than dancing around it because they want to draw players to a format.
I actually do think that viewpoint is severely misguided from Wizards. I don't think too many Modern Tron players are looking to pick up Pauper Tron, as though they both do play Tron lands. Those two decks could not play differently, and I really don't see... I would like to see the actual number of Modern Tron pilots who would even consider playing Pauper in the first place. Right? Like, if we're going to talk pure numbers here, I don't think that it's a net positive to keep Tron lands in the formats as opposed to keep them out of the format. If the intention and current viewpoint from Wizards of the Coast is that they are a draw to the formats, I would counter in saying that Gush was a way bigger draw to the format, and that's gone. We can't have that. So... I mean, if we're just looking at pure numbers here, I would like to see some actual data. Obviously, it's going to be very difficult to run such a study, but I'm not buying it. I'm not buying that narrative. I think it's misguided, but it is what it is. It's what they believe, and I'm not in a position to sway them otherwise. So we are stuck with Tron lands for this time.
Yes, we definitely are. I have a lot of choice words to say about Wizards and their decisions lately that I'm going to keep off the podcast, but I agree their choice was misguided.
Well, now that we are in the, post-map, post-Sanctuary metagame, and you have been adding some flavor in the kitchen. Let's get into the deck list itself, because I'm sure most of the listeners are very interested in where you started with this deck and where you arrived at this deck. So to sort of take me through this deck building process from the first thought of, hey, I want to do X, to this is my finished product.
Yeah, sure. So this is probably a bit lesser known. The original deck list was built when Astrolabe was very, very new, before people had broken it. I had wanted to build a Bant Ephemerate list because the Mano had worked with Coiling Oracle and all that Ephemerate stuff, and Astrolabe had allowed that. I had a little bit of results with it, but I never really took it into challenges or anything. It was more of just a for fun thing, but it was good enough. I did well in leagues that I played it with, and then Tron and Jeskai happened, and I had to be a bit more competitive. And then the map ban had come around, and I had built a list and played it a little bit. I think the list was fine. I don't really think anything was wrong with that Tron list. I had results with it. I just didn't really enjoy it. I had planned on playing it competitively because it was super strong. And then on one of my off-camera days, because I do play Magic off the camera, just to relax and chill, because I do love Magic, I didn't want to play Tron. My familiars list that I had played so much with Sanctuary banned I thought was dead, so I needed something new, and I wanted to play Flicker, so I took a revisit, going through all my old Stream Decker lists and all that stuff, and I found this list with Astrolabe, and I realized the Thriving Lands might make it possible. So I threw it together in maybe like 10 minutes, maybe less, played a league with it, and I realized it was pretty real. The list was doing well, it was performing well. It was very rough at the time, but I saw something in it and started streaming it and working on it, and now here we are with the 2 top 8s.
So I do want to ask you a few questions about the deck itself, and they're going to come from a position where I'm sort of in the know. So I want to back up, and I want you to sort of explain what this deck does to someone who might be looking at this deck and just wondering, how does this win?
Yeah, sure. So we're actually going to back up even further. This being a Flicker Ephemerate deck, I have a philosophy on these. The best way to play a Flicker effect is to interact with my opponent as little as on as few fronts as possible. I'm not going to say as little as possible because that's wrong, but I want to control where I interact with them. Part of that is I want to be ahead on mana, so I don't have to interact with the amount of spells I can play in turn against my opponent. I always want to be ahead there. B, I don't want to deal with their threats, so I play Fogs. That is a necessary part. Then C, I don't want to care about the removal. Those are the 3 ways I've decided to cut off at avenues of interaction for my opponent. I still have to care about their counters and stuff like that, but the less fronts I can interact with, the more successful a Flicker deck is going to be. And how I did that is through Coiling Oracle, giving me mana advantage while providing me a chump blocker to stop combat. The Fogs, obviously, for being good. And then the Archaeomancer Ephemerate loop, along with Pulse Marasa, for that classic your removal doesn't matter portion. And that's kind of the core of the deck. As for how I actually win, it's through an Archaeomancer lock. There's multiple ways to achieve that. Ephemerate buying back a Fog every turn. Ephemerate buying back Temporal Spring to put a card back on top of their library, giving them no new outs. There's a lot of ways to win once you actually achieve that late game Flicker lock. Does that answer it? I know I went a little bit further back, but I want to make sure I answered the original question.
I think you did a good job, yeah. So now that we understand how this deck wins, can you walk me through a few of your card selection choices? I noticed that you have 2 Moment's Peace and 1 Weather the Storm, and I suspect I know the answer as why that is, but could you explain to the listeners why you've arrived at that split?
So I'm guessing you actually don't know the answer. Believe it or not, the answer is Boros. Game 1, we cannot kill them at all. They have Core Skyfisher, they have the Monarch, and they have a lot of burn. You are just never going to deal enough damage and answer all of their permanents in a reasonable amount of time. How games usually end up going against them, I had found, especially Game 1, I have a postboard answer now, but Game 1, when I originally built the list, I didn't have that answer, so it was the entire match. I found I could never kill them. I decked them 6 out of 7 times I played against them. I let the Monarch resolve, and I let them deck themselves. So I found a few players smartened up the second time I played against them, and they wouldn't use their burn at all. Even if I was trying to flicker a creature, they know I couldn't kill them in time. I have no way to get past the Core Skyfisher wall, so they had held onto all 4 Galvanic Blast, all 4 Lightning Bolts with the Monarch, and just burned me out. And Pulse Looping is a little too slow for that. I actually added Weather the Storm to help Game 1 against them. Just get out of that burn range so I can continue to lock them out and deck them when they have their own Monarch.
Well, you're absolutely correct. If this were a multiple choice question where, is Weather the Storm there for burn, there for Boros, or they're for a Tog being able to be flung at you and ignoring the Moment's Peace lock as early as game 1, I would have chosen C, because I really thought it was there for the possibility of a larger Tog being flung at you, or maybe even those Bogles lists that occasionally have the similar effect in their main deck.
Well, let's dive down a bit further into that. So the reason why it's not for those matchups, the reason I don't need Weather the Storm and the other matchups would be because, unlike Boros, I can Temporal Spring lock them, so I don't actually have to worry about them drawing their out of Fling because I give them 0 outs to draw. But when Boros, my game plan against them is decking them, I can't realistically expect them to not draw all of their burn. So the reason I chose Weather is it does help against the other matchups. It is a functional fog against them because it does gain enough life to buy a turn or two, but the end game is still to lock them out and give them 0 outs through Temporal Spring. Boros just happens to be a matchup where that is not realistic given the Moto clock.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down. It is actually just a little bit surprising that it's there for Boros, but when you break it down like that, it does make perfect sense. I had assumed that you were decking Boros, but I wasn't at that next level of understanding where the Boros players have figured that out as well and have already made their own adjustments, forcing you to make additional adjustments to the gameplay.
Yeah, it was pretty fast. I faced the same guy twice in a league, and he had it figured out on the second time we faced each other. This is before I had added that Claws of the Wirewood in the sideboard, and I was just like, man, I really wish I had a Weather the Storm main deck. I'm kind of helpless against this guy holding on to his burn. I know he's doing it, and I know I can't do anything about it.
Speaking of Claws of Wirewood, that was most definitely one of my questions that I had. What matchups is Claws of Wirewood coming in? It sounds like Boros is among them.
Yeah, it's been an overperformer against Boros. It's so insane against them. It also just happens to be really good against the random Delver deck, Fairies deck, stuff like that. It cycles, so it's hard to be dead there. It does help there, but Boros was the idea of having it in my sideboard.
Speaking of your sideboard, I noticed that between your 6th place finish and your 4th place finish, you added a pair of counterspells to the sideboard. Could you walk me through the 2-2 split?
Okay, so the idea on moving between Counterspell and Dispel was because I had found that as I play more of these matchups, I find Dispel and Counterspell do similar things in a lot of the matchups I want, but Dispel doesn't always come in the matchups where I would want to Counterspell. Let's take Walls, for example. It's not a great matchup, right? It's pretty bad for us. I try to fog them. They don't care about combat. We're just not interacting on the same plane of existence, which is a lot of the power of both my deck and their deck. Theirs just happens to be slightly faster when neither of us interact. And Dispel does absolutely nothing against them, while Counterspell is very good. So I had found myself cutting all of my fogs and not having enough to bring in against Walls, and that was kind of where the original idea of cutting Dispel for Counterspell came from. So I went ahead and looked at all of the other matchups where I would bring in Dispel and cut my fogs for, and the big ones were Tron and the Fairies decks. Those are kind of the big ones I want Dispel for. And against Fairies, Counterspell is slightly less mana efficient, but it does hit Spellsetter Sprite. That was a trade-off I'm okay with, so that's still on Counterspell team. And then against Tron, I believe the Counterspell is actually better, because I found, due to the lock that exists with Temporal Spring, I just want to stop them from applying pressure early game, whether that be through a Denova Horror or through a Muldrifter that gets Cave of Temptations. I want to counter their creatures more than anything else, so I found Counterspell to be an upgrade there. And then just kind of felt like a no-brainer to run Counterspell for Dispel after thinking it through like that.
Well, what about the choice in terms of you have one main deck Dispel, 2 main deck Counterspell, and then the 2 Counterspell on the board and an additional Dispel? Is there any case to be made for just a 3-1 split with the Counterspells in the main deck, putting all copies of Dispel on the sideboard, or is there a specific matchup that I'm not considering here?
It's not so much matchup, it's more of a mana efficiency consideration. You want to be using your mana as efficiently as possible. You want to use it all every turn. You know, basic Magic stuff there. It sounds easy to say, but it becomes relevant, especially when you're trying to go for an Archaeomancer Ephemerate lock. You want to have access to that Dispel somewhere in that fight, because Counterspell Ephemerate Counterspell is 5 mana when they're fighting over your Ephemerate lock, whereas Dispel Ephemerate Dispel is only 3. So even though it's a one-of, and the matchups where you actually care about that interaction, you're going to see a lot of cards and you're going to find it. So that's why I want access to it rather than just having 3 Counterspell main deck.
I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. It has been about a year since I played a deck like this, since we lost Arkham's Astrolabe in the format, but I do remember wanting access to main deck Dispel while I was trying to lock people out with Ephemerate. So, I mean, so long as these counter spells are really just there to force through the combo, that makes perfect sense to me that you want access to dispel as well. Now, the additional counter magic that you have in your sideboard, the 2 copies of Exclude, again, I'm going to guess they're there for Tron and maybe Boros Monarch, but am I wrong?
You're wrong in Monarch, because at the end of the day, I keep in Stonehorn against Boros. Their creatures come down a little too early, and they're way too cheap for me to bring Exclude in, so I found just letting Stonehorn get there and eventually finding Claws of the Wirewood to clean up whatever is on the board is a lot easier than fighting with Exclude. But it is there for Tron. I board into control against them because the main game plan of fogging them out, that's a lot of pieces that can just be cut, so I want room for more control.
You definitely have some dead cards in your main deck against Tron in the form of Stonehorn Dignitaries. You've got Weather the Storm, Moment's Peace, so it totally makes sense to want to board into a slightly different configuration and approach the matchup that way. I just figured that usually Exclude's pretty solid against Boros Monarch. Not so solid against Boros Bully, but I was curious if that was coming in as well. But let's talk about a card in your sideboard that I am very confident I am going to be very wrong in my assumptions. That is Sunlance, right? And tell me why you're not just using it for Thermo Alchemist, because I look at Sunlance and I think Thermo Alchemist. I mean, you have the Blue Elemental Blasts, but what else is the Sunlance hitting?
You've probably noticed I'm really particular about what I want out of my sideboard cards. Like, I want it for matchup A, but I also want it to be relevant in matchups B and C, even if it's not the All-Star. So Sunlance reasoning is the conditions I want fulfilled. I want it to kill walls while not being dead against Delver, and I want it to be bought back with Archaeomancer. Those are the 3 requirements in this card. Sunlance happens to be the only card that fills that, as compared to, like, let's say Journey to Nowhere or Last Breath, because Last Breath does not kill Philip Delver. So that's actually what it's for. The walls is the main matchup, because that is such a awful matchup for us. But Delver is enough of a threat that I wanted extra answers to it. It happens to be playable against Thermo Alchemist as well, but that's not really the main point of it.
Yeah, I figured I would get that one wrong. Maybe even if it were multiple choice. I figured I would get the Sunlance wrong. I figured there was more to that than what I was seeing. My guesses were, Thermo Alchemist followed by turn 1 Delvers, as obviously turn 3 and turn 4 Delvers your deck can naturally handle without issue.
Yeah, so Burn is kind of an afterthought just because it's so ridiculously favored for us. We have Weather the Storm and 2 Pulse of Marasa main deck, so Burn tends to be an afterthought when I build my sideboard.
My final consideration was maybe it's there for some elves, because you can't necessarily always lock them if they hang on to a lead of the Stampede.
I'm going to be honest, I haven't seen elves in months. I don't know if it's really a deck that's played anymore, because it's so unpopular right now. I have zero thought of it in my sideboard.
Yeah, well, fair enough. I mean, that was, like I said, I knew I wasn't going to quite nail what all these cards are coming in for, but that was the one I was very confident that I was going to be most off on.
Yeah, it's the one I get the most questions about too on stream. So,
how much are you enjoying the versatility of Return to Nature?
Return to Nature I've actually been a little disappointed in. So I get this question a lot because I do it when I play Tron as well. Why don't you bring in Ancient Grudge against Affinity while you're playing Tron? The answer is they have so many artifacts that it doesn't matter, and your game plan is to fog them out, so why would I want to take a step away from my main game plan of fogging them out to answer a random artifact? The answer is you don't want to. So I actually don't really bring in Return to Nature that much. It's specifically for the Tron matchup because of Bonder's Ornament as well as their flicker effects on the off chance I actually want to target one of those. But I don't bring it in against Boggles, I don't bring it in against Affinity, because my main game plan is to Stonehorn them out, and then after that I have an option as far as room in my deck for utility cards. It's either Counterspell or Return to Nature. Counterspell is going to do a much better job in stopping their random fling effects, and it does answer a piece of pressure when I need it to early game.
One of these deck building choices, people who don't watch the stream are going to be, they've essentially missed it. And what I'm referring to is the Seagate Oracle swap, where you had Seagate Oracles, and then you took them out, and then you put them back in. Could you walk me through that process?
Yeah, so the other card, for those that aren't aware, is Llanowar Visionary. The 3-mana 2/2, it cantrips and it adds a mana. So the original thought process behind switching them out was, I just want to turbo out my game plan. The mana sounds great. It's still cantripping, so the flickers can still target it. It sounds really good on paper because you can speed out Muldrifters. And then I found in practice, card selection is a bigger deal because I'm essentially a combo deck at the end of the day. I'm looking to assemble Archaeomancer Ephemerate. I do that through a large amount of card advantage, but at the end of the day, that's still what I want, right? So the card selection from Seagate Oracle matters a lot. That's really all it is at the end of the day. That one extra card per flicker, it really, you see a lot of extra cards because you're not just playing one Seagate Oracle. You're playing a Seagate Oracle, flickering it twice, and then playing another. So when you add that up, it's 4 to 5 extra cards seen compared to Llanowar Visionary. So that's why I decided to stay with Oracle.
So I do feel like we've sort of covered this to some extent organically in discussing your card selection choices between the main deck, between the sideboard, correcting my assumptions along the way. But for anyone looking to pick up your deck and start playing with it, what decks do you want to play against, and what decks do you not want to play against?
So you want to see aggro and burn all day long. That is what you're the best against. So imagine you're playing, for those who are somewhat familiar with Pauper, you're playing an aggro deck, you're playing against Tron. You feel pretty bad because they're super good at fogging you. Now imagine if they had cantrips to find those fogs that much more consistently. That's what we're doing. So our aggro matchup's fantastic because you don't need Tron to actually fog them out. So we cut the Tron and have cantrips and a much better aggro matchup. As far as what I don't want to see, it's actually pretty similar to Tron. I don't want to see the other Tron decks, and I don't want to see walls because we have all made the same decision of we don't want to actually interact with our opponents that much. We just want to get our own game plan, and that adds a varying amount of variance to the matchups, so you want to avoid those if you can.
Are there any cards that you're considering at this time, now that you've been playing with the deck for a few weeks, you've got some leagues in with it, you've had back-to-back challenge top 8s, you've got the experience with the deck. Is this list the final configuration?
I think I'm close to the final configuration. I don't think I'm there yet. The biggest one is probably the sideboard and the Tron matchup. So I'm going to be honest, I haven't played enough Tron players to really have that matchup figured out. Like, I'm not sure if I really want Return to Nature. I could see actually just running 4 Temporal Spring and rushing for that Archaeomancer lock. I'm not sure where to go with that matchup. If anything changes, it's going to be with that matchup in mind.
Now, I had the opportunity to play with Coiling Oracle when it was in Standard, and it was pretty sweet when you successfully landed a bounce land off of that reveal. How good does that feel every time you resolve Coiling Oracle and you find a Simic Growth Chamber?
Let me put it this way. Your ideal start in this deck is turn 2 Oracle hitting Growth Chamber, and your win rate skyrockets.
Would you be going so far to aggressively ephemerate Coiling Oracles, or are you sort of trying to hang on to them until you find a Mull Drifter?
So let's actually talk about that, because that's a big part of how you play this deck out. There's all of these flicker targets, and we have a lot of flickers. So the big difference between this deck and Tron holds on to their flickers and makes sure it gets value out of them because that's how they win. This deck is actually the complete opposite. I will ephemerate a creature into my opponent's mana up on their end step just to tap it so I can untap and play 2 more flickers because I've got so much card advantage. I just want to push it out there. I want to convert it into actual cards as fast as possible. So I will ephemerate the second I get an opportunity to. It doesn't matter what I'm ephemerating more often than not, as long as I'm getting value out of that card. And sometimes it's just so I can get value out of more ephemerate by tapping my opponent's mana.
Well, I mean, your deck is full of solid ephemerate targets, so aggressively ephemerating can't be too bad. Okay, now that we know a bit about the deck, its design, implementation, and current build, as well as understanding all the ins and outs of the sideboarding and the matchups themselves, could you walk us through how you made your top 4 appearance?
Of course. So I ended up with a pretty favorable field overall, honestly. I don't know if I was lucky or if that was the actual field. I haven't gotten to go over the numbers yet, but a lot of aggro and a lot of Boros I ran into. So our round 1 was Stompy. We fogged them out as usual. Our round 2 was actually, I should have mentioned this earlier, the actual Nightmare matchup, but I didn't mention it because it's not really a competitive deck. Land Destruction. We play 4 bounce lands. Land Destruction's pretty great against us. We got demolished, and our poor opponent didn't win a match since then, because I've got choice words for Land Destruction in this meta. I will not repeat. Then round 3, we had Stompy again. Fogged them out as usual. Nothing too crazy. We had a Boros matchup. I believe we decked them game 1, and then game 2, I didn't really get to do much of my sideboard plan. I had an early Temporal Spring on a bounce land, and they didn't get to play Magic, so I killed them with some random card advantage creatures. Then we had Burn. Burn is a great matchup for us. We had Weather the Storm and Pulse, and then post board. They drew 2 creatures. We had the Sunlance Archaeomancer Sunlance for them, and the game was over from there. Then we had Boros again. Game 1, I won through decking, I believe. I could be wrong. I think I actually beat them. They kept a weird hand, and I was able to steal it with Temporal Spring. Game 2 was actually a really weird one. I drew all my flickers early. I used them aggressively because I needed to play the game, and they had the Graveyard Hate to exile almost all of my flickers, but I believe one. And then I had still managed to stack up enough fogs of Stonehorns through those flickers, and I had seen most of my deck out of resources. I top deck Claws of the Wirewood for 6 out of their 8 flying creatures, and they were unable to stop my Mole Drifters from killing them, despite me having 0 flickers left in my deck. So that was a pretty interesting game against them. And our round 7 opponent was the only undefeated in the tournament at the time, so they didn't really feel like playing the matchup out. They asked me what deck I was on. I told them truthfully, told them they could look it up, and they conceded because they're already locked. No sense in playing it out after I tell them what I'm on. Then in the top 8, I faced a Boros player again. I would recommend going, if you're going to go back and watch any games, it would be this one. It was a really fantastic one, down to the wire. In the end, we both had about a minute left on our clock. It was a very, very close match. They played well. My sideboard plan worked against them. I ended up having to Temporal Spring my own permanents to stop myself from decking while having the Monarch. It was a really fun one. And then quarterfinals, we faced a Boggles player, another aggro deck, so pretty favorable matchup for us. Then game 2, I saw a single Fog, a single Stonehorn, no flickers for it, nothing. So I had played Stonehorn on turn 4, and I died on turn 5 because I never found the flicker. Then the next game we mulled 2-5. We had only found 1 Fog yet again, and we died on turn 5. Happens like that sometimes. Fail rates exist for a reason.
Now, if I were a betting man, I might just place a bet on Temporal Springing your own permanents to not deck being the play of the day. But is there a sweeter one?
Not really. That was it was really wild. Temporal Springing your opponent's bounce land on the play is also pretty amazing, but that's less exciting and more just backbreaking. Further on the Temporal Spring bet in that match, I had my first one exiled through a Bojuka Bog. Not a big deal. I have 2 copies. So later in the game, my opponent has a Relic, and I have Ephemerate getting it back on my upkeep, and that was my last one. I knew I was going to deck because I had the Monarch, and there was about 10 cards left in my library. There's no way I'm killing him in time because I only had a single Mole Drifter, and he was at a lot of life. I had to brainstorm on my upkeep in response to a Relic activation to find a flicker effect to buy back that Temporal Spring so I could stop myself from decking.
So the play's even sweeter then.
Yeah, I had to fight very hard just to play a card on myself.
Yeah, I think that's most definitely a play of the day. In fact, that's one of the spicier plays of the days I think we've had on the podcast altogether. And I'm hoping that you can follow it up with an equally amazing ability for Slivers, so long that it is, of course, silly.
Well, let's stay on flavor. When Temporal Sliver enters the battlefield, put target permanent on top of its owner's library.
That could get silly pretty quickly. This week, my Silly Slivers ability is based on the observation that your deck has so many value creatures that generate an important effect upon entering the battlefield. Slivers are a bit more communistic, I would say. And I don't mean that in any political way, simply that it's more community. That etymology of the word there, rather than the political connotation. All slivers have static abilities, which means all slivers have a different concept of value. It's about sharing the value. You don't want to be like Metallic Sliver. Metallic Sliver's the guy who shows up at the party without any beverages. You don't want to be that guy. You'll see him standing alone in the corner later. And at some point, I'm sure, Universal Automaton will show up and people will be like, yo, who invited that guy? And it'll be Metallic Sliver. So thanks so much for coming back onto the podcast. It was definitely a pleasure, and I appreciated the education in learning about these different sideboard selection choices and how they fit into your overall synergy with the deck.
Yeah, no problem. So I enjoyed being on again. I will always enjoy talking about Magic. It never gets old.
And for anyone who's not familiar with your content, where can they find you?
They can find me on twitch.tv/Birbman263. Burb with a B, 2 B's, B-I-R-B. And if they're playing Magic Online, they'll see me as Entropy263. if I'm on Magic Online, there's a very good chance I'm streaming as well.
And thanks once more to my guest for coming on the podcast. Always interesting to have conversations with Birbman, and I don't think I necessarily did so well on my self-imposed pop quiz. Of course, that is the beauty of being able to speak to the players who are shaping the metagame, because not only does it provide me with the opportunity to hear their insights, but it also allows me to correct mistakes that I and other players could easily be making, working off of basic assumptions that every player makes once they first see a published list. Once you see someone's sideboard, you just immediately start making assumptions for how they're sideboarding. There's other examples as well. So very, very happy to have Birbman back on the podcast, and it's only a matter of time, I'm sure, before we will hear from him again. He's constantly crafting new, interesting decks, and I imagine a lot of people want to play with those decks, and that's the type of person that I wish to speak with most. One whose voice will be heard and appreciated, but also used by the Pauper community at large. Coming up on the podcast, it's done. I know all slivers have been very patient with me, but we have the Showcase Challenge interview, and I hope that it'll still prove useful, an interview, for anyone looking to play Blue-Red Fae or Blue-Red Scred, whatever you wish to call the deck. Looking forward to bringing that interview to you after all this time, so I do hope that you will join me next time, and I'll see you then.